When the Pacific was still dark, just before dawn pressed its first pale line against the horizon, strange silhouettes waited along the American coastline. They looked like hulls, broad, confident, unmistakably naval. Their decks appeared level, their shadows sharp, their outlines convincing even to the trained eye of a bomber crew. Yet, if anyone had stepped closer, the truth would have shattered the illusion instantly. These ships were not steel giants. They were painted plywood, stretched canvas, hollow frames braced by carpenters instead of shipwrights. In the half-light, they did not merely resemble warships, they performed as them. This was the American Phantom Fleet, an entire navy that did not exist, built to be seen, bombed, photographed, and feared. A fleet crafted in silence but designed to echo across the war. In the early months after Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers inside the U.S. Navy faced a problem that was as urgent as it was invisible. They knew the West Coast was vulnerable. They knew the Japanese had long-range reconnaissance aircraft, submarines, and an aggressive doctrine built around surprise. And they knew that the industrial ports of California and Washington, crammed with shipyards, fuel depots, and repair facilities, were not ready for another blow. The United States could not risk placing its limited, surviving capital ships directly in harm's way. But it also could not leave the coastline looking empty, exposed, or strategically transparent. A visible presence was needed, an unmistakable message to any enemy aviator searching the shorelines. The U.S. Navy is here, waiting, watching, ready. Yet the real fleet was thousands of miles away. That contradiction, an urgent need for visibility, and an equally urgent need to hide the truth, sparked one of the most unusual engineering projects of the war. American commanders didn't simply want decoys. They wanted an optical illusion so convincing it could absorb enemy reconnaissance, interfere with target calculations, and distort the enemy's sense of U.S. naval strength. Engineers, artists, carpenters, camouflage specialists, and intelligence officers gathered in secret workshops near Seattle, San Diego, and Los Angeles. Their mission was not to build ships, but to build belief. And belief required precision. Scale, shape, shadow. The triangular tension of a destroyer's bow. The boxy confidence of a carrier's island. The smooth curvature of a cruiser's hull. Everything had to be correct, from the silhouette down to the mooring positions that a reconnaissance analyst would expect. Every line that defined American sea power had to be rebuilt with wood, canvas, tar, and paint. By mid-1942, what rose along the American coastline was unprecedented. Entire clusters of fake vessels, detailed enough to fool enemy optics at altitude, and cheap enough to abandon the moment the real fleet returned home. Some of these ships were so large they required scaffolding like movie sets. Others were small enough to be moved overnight. Their mission was not to survive combat. Their mission was to invite it. And they would, very soon. To understand why the Phantom Fleet became necessary, we have to return to a coastline still trembling from the shock of December 7th. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not only crippled battleships, it had shattered the illusion of distance. The Pacific, once perceived as a vast shield, had become a highway straight to America's front door. By early 1942, U.S. intelligence intercepted multiple signals suggesting that the Japanese Navy was mapping American port facilities from afar. Submarines had surfaced near Santa Barbara, shelling an oil facility just to prove they could reach it. Shore observers reported unidentified aircraft over Oregon. Rumors spread faster than official reports could correct them. And in Washington, one possibility loomed darker than the rest. If Japan launched a coordinated reconnaissance and strike mission along the West Coast, American shipyards, crucial for rebuilding the fleet, would be prime targets. The war planners' dilemma was immediate and severe. The West Coast held 30% of America's naval construction capability, critical drydocks for carrier repair, massive fuel storage depots, and rail links that fed the entire Pacific war effort. But strategically, the region was vulnerable in a way the Atlantic was not. The Navy's surviving capital ships were in motion, repairing, regrouping, redeploying. The Pacific Fleet was a shadow of what it had been just months earlier. What remained could not be risked near population centers or unfinished defensive networks. The coastline needed protection. But the Navy had no ships to spare. This is where the idea began to mutate from desperation into creativity. A handful of officers, experts in camouflage, deception, and fleet logistics, proposed something so unconventional it seemed almost theatrical: erect false ships, convincingly shaped and properly positioned, to simulate a defensive naval presence. Camouflage units had already proven they could disguise factories and airfields. But creating an entire fleet was a different challenge. It required blending engineering realism with psychological design. The Japanese reconnaissance doctrine depended heavily on silhouette recognition. If an observer saw what appeared to be a cruiser, a carrier group, or a column of destroyers lined up in port, their reports would treat them as authentic, no matter what they were made of. The U.S. Navy quickly realized the power of such misdirection. False ships could draw bombers away from real targets, distort enemy assessments of American naval strength, create the illusion of readiness, and force Japanese command to reconsider the risk of a direct strike. But there was another motive, rarely spoken of in official papers: morale. Cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle lived under the fear of attack. A visible naval presence, even an artificial one, reassured civilians and workers moving through shipyards under blackout conditions. Sometimes, psychological warfare was aimed inward as much as outward. By late spring of 1942, the decision was finalized. The United States would build not merely decoys, but believable ships, massive, persuasive, functional illusions capable of misleading anyone looking from the sky or from miles offshore. What followed was one of the most ambitious collaborations of the war. Naval architects bonding with Hollywood scenic designers, carpenters working beside intelligence officers, and camouflage artists testing shadows under different angles of daylight. A navy of phantoms was about to rise. The first challenge facing the engineers was deceptively simple. A decoy ship could not merely resemble a vessel, it had to behave like one. From altitude, Japanese reconnaissance pilots would judge not only shape but also proportion, shadow, reflection, and the logic of placement inside a harbor. Illusion required discipline, and discipline required engineering. The design teams began by breaking real warships into pure geometry. Battleships were studied as silhouettes, triangles, arcs, slopes, and towers. Cruisers became ratios of length to beam. Destroyers were distilled into the sharp, predatory taper of their bows. The goal was not to recreate functional steel hulls. The goal was to capture the optical fingerprint of each class. Blueprints of actual U.S. Navy vessels were reviewed and abstracted. Carpenters worked from outlines that looked almost like architectural sketches. Instead of listing armor thickness or turret elevation, these drawings highlighted shadow behavior: how light fell on superstructures, how decks darkened under overcast skies, how a carrier's island cast its mass across the flight deck. To deceive an enemy pilot, the Phantom Fleet had to speak the language of altitude. Materials were chosen for speed and illusion, not durability. Plywood became hull plating. Stretched canvas mimicked smooth steel surfaces. Timber frames replaced internal bulkheads. Paint techniques imitated rust, weathering, and hatch lines. Rope rigging stood in for cables and antennae. Some decoys even featured fake anchor chains crafted from lightweight molds. Others had inflatable components, sections that could be set up in hours but still cast convincing shadows. Where a real warship demanded tens of thousands of tons of steel and a workforce of thousands, a Phantom ship required a team of 30 carpenters, a few camouflage specialists, and an afternoon's worth of quiet cooperation. But static realism was only half the requirement. A ship floating improperly would betray the illusion. To solve this, engineers designed pontoon-supported bases that gave the wooden hulls a natural, gentle oscillation. The decoys rose with the tide, dipped with currents, and swayed lightly in the wind, just enough to mimic displacement without revealing their weightlessness. From the air, it was convincing. Too convincing, in fact. Early tests conducted with U.S. pilots revealed that several mock destroyers were indistinguishable from real ones at altitudes above 3,000 feet. One pilot mistook a decoy cruiser in Puget Sound for an actual vessel and circled it twice before realizing something was off. There was no crew on deck, no heat signature, no movement, and yet the silhouette was perfect. This success created a new problem: logistics. Phantom ships needed harbors, mooring patterns, and formation logic that mimicked naval doctrine. Naval officers designed port layouts that mirrored authentic battlegroup organization, placing destroyers near harbor entrances, clustering cruisers around fuel depots, and creating the illusion of a defensive line. The result was uncanny. Entire fleets materialized seemingly overnight. Fleets that did not sail, did not fire, and yet played a strategic role as real as steel. Soon, the Phantom Fleet would face its first test under enemy observation, and the Pacific would begin to believe in shadows. On a clear morning in late 1942, a Japanese reconnaissance submarine surfaced briefly off the California coast. Its periscope rose through the swells, searching the shoreline for silhouettes, fuel depots, and the telltale masts of American naval strength. What the observer saw through the lens would travel, encrypted, all the way to Tokyo. At a distance, the water was calm. The haze lifted slowly from the harbor. And then, a shape. Long, angular, unmistakable. A destroyer's profile. Further down the bay, another. And then a carrier, its deck stretching like a pale runway in the morning light. To the east, cruisers lay at anchor, their superstructures catching the sun, their shadows falling exactly where a trained analyst expected them to. The Japanese observer sketched what he witnessed, carefully marking mast heights, relative spacing, and estimated tonnage. Everything looked correct. Everything followed logic. Everything matched the silhouette and doctrine charts carried aboard the submarine. He could not know that the steel hull of the carrier was canvas pulled tight over ribs of soft timber. He could not know that the destroyers he traced into his notebook were hollow frames floating on pontoons. He could not know that the very ships he was documenting had been painted the night before by teams who worked beneath blackout curtains. His report reached Tokyo within days. It described 1 fleet carrier, 2 heavy cruisers, at least 5 destroyers, and supporting vessels at anchor. Japanese intelligence analysts compared the numbers to pre-war U.S. ship registries and grew concerned. They believed the Americans were rebuilding faster than expected. They speculated that the West Coast now protected a reserve fleet ready to defend against, or launch, offensive operations. They had no idea the vessels were shadows. Meanwhile, in the United States, the reaction to the intercepted Japanese reconnaissance message was cautious satisfaction. The deception officers had not celebrated. They understood the stakes. To fool the enemy once was luck. To fool them consistently would require constant maintenance, adaptation, and precision. The Phantom Fleet would need regular repainting, adjustments to mooring positions, simulated activity such as empty fuel drums on deck, fake maintenance scaffolding, and, when necessary, deliberate signs of crew presence created with props. The illusion could not remain static. It had to breathe. And soon, enemy aircraft, not just submarines, would put that illusion to the test. Because the Pacific War was about to escalate, and the Japanese High Command was preparing a probing strike along the American coastline. A strike meant to test defenses. A strike that could mistake shadows for targets. And that was exactly what American planners hoped for. The first Japanese aircraft to approach the American West Coast after Pearl Harbor did not come as part of a major strike force. It came quietly, 2 long-range floatplanes launched from submarines operating in the deep Pacific. Their mission was simple: observe, test, and, if possible, strike. In early 1943, the Japanese Navy began a series of reconnaissance flights designed to pressure American defenses and probe for weaknesses. Most of these flights focused on detecting fuel depots, ship concentrations, and coastal artillery positions. What they found instead was the Phantom Fleet, lined up in predictable, doctrinal order. Destroyers guarding harbor mouths. A carrier moored at a central quay. Cruisers positioned as if protecting repair facilities. From the air, the illusion was immaculate. A floatplane flying at 8,000 feet registered the decoys as legitimate tonnage. Its observer photographed the harbor through a small optical camera. The film, once developed aboard the submarine, revealed shadows, mast lines, and hull forms exactly consistent with U.S. naval silhouettes. Believing they had located a valuable cluster of warships, the Japanese command authorized a limited strike, no more than a symbolic attack meant to disrupt American activity and gather additional images of the harbor layout. On a foggy morning, the aircraft returned. This time, it carried small incendiary payloads intended to start fires on ship decks or in nearby storage areas. The pilot descended, broke through a cloud layer, and lined up the carrier at anchor. From his perspective, the target's flight deck was clear, its island superstructure visible, its hull casting a broad shadow across the calm water. He committed to the attack run. The first incendiary bomb fell cleanly, hitting the deck just aft of the island. Instead of erupting in fire across steel plating, it tore through canvas stretched over timber ribs and fell into the hollow interior of the decoy ship, producing a plume of smoke but no detonation. The second bomb struck a destroyer, punching straight through the plywood hull and splashing harmlessly into the bay. The pilot radioed confirmation of hits. He reported, "light damage inflicted." And he never realized he had just bombed a forest disguised as a fleet. Back on shore, U.S. Navy deception officers rushed to the impact sites. They patched holes in the canvas, reinforced weakened structures, and, most importantly, modified the visual damage on the decoys so that, in subsequent reconnaissance, the Japanese would believe their strike had achieved moderate effect. One cruiser decoy even had a section of its railings purposefully removed and replaced with charred wood to mimic blast trauma. Smoke pots were ignited on deck for the next aerial overflight. The goal was not to show invulnerability. The goal was to show credibility. If the Phantom Fleet looked too perfect, too untouched, the Japanese might become suspicious. Damage, controlled, curated, believable damage, was part of the deception. The attack was small, but the implications were enormous. Japanese intelligence concluded that the strike had disrupted American naval activity and that the forces in the harbor had been caught by surprise. The truth was that the Americans had orchestrated the entire scene. And now, realizing the decoys had not merely worked but had absorbed real enemy ordnance, U.S. commanders saw an opportunity far greater than simple misdirection. The Phantom Fleet could become a strategic tool, one that shaped Japanese decisions at the operational level. What began as theater was turning into influence. By mid-1943, something remarkable had occurred inside Japanese naval intelligence. The Phantom Fleet had become a data point. Not a rumor, not an anomaly, but an integrated element of their strategic picture of the American West Coast. Japanese analysts studying reconnaissance photos believed they were tracking the slow but steady reconstitution of U.S. naval strength. The decoy carrier, painstakingly repainted and repositioned, appeared again and again in imagery collected by submarine-launched floatplanes. Destroyer silhouettes shifted mooring locations just often enough to imply regular patrols. Fake maintenance scaffolds were added, removed, or relocated to suggest ongoing repairs. And because the Japanese had no real-time intelligence beyond these glimpses, the patterns began to harden into assessments. Reports forwarded to the Imperial Navy General Staff included lines such as, "Carrier group estimated in defensive posture along U.S. West Coast. Cruiser elements appear present at major industrial ports. Destroyer screen likely protecting shipyard infrastructure." None of this was true. All of it shaped Japanese planning. The Phantom Fleet's presence altered three major calculations inside Japanese command circles. 1. Percepco de risco. A visible American fleet suggested that any strike on West Coast infrastructure might be met with naval resistance. The Japanese Navy, stretched thin across the Pacific, could not afford to lose aircraft to a defensive trap. 2. Estimativa de capacidad industrial americana. The decoys implied that the United States was regenerating ships more quickly than expected. This accelerated timetable forced Japanese strategists to reconsider how much time they had before U.S. carrier groups would dominate the Central Pacific. 3. Prioridades operationize. Because the west coast appeared defended, Japan chose to concentrate effort on the Aleutians and the Solomons instead, campaigns that drained resources it could not replenish. The Americans, however, were not content to let the deception operate passively. Deception officers introduced variability, moving ships slightly between nights, creating the impression of routine harbor activity. Some decoys were deliberately taken out of service, meaning their masts or superstructures were partially dismantled to simulate maintenance cycles. The goal was to maintain the illusion of operational tempo. Meanwhile, real U.S. naval intelligence intercepted Japanese communications referencing the decoys as though they were genuine assets. One decoded message expressed concern that American fleet units remained dispersed but present. This confirmation electrified the deception teams. A force that did not exist was exerting real strategic weight. Behind the scenes, logistical officers took advantage of the illusion. With the Japanese convinced that the coastline was defended, U.S. shipyards operated under less threat, focusing their output on the Pacific campaigns that truly mattered: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the build-up to the Marianas. The Phantom Fleet had performed its mission perfectly. It turned Japanese attention away from the American mainland and bought precious time for the real fleet to grow. But the United States had no intention of letting the deception fade. The next evolution would push the illusion further, beyond static silhouettes and into the realm of dynamic misdirection. The war was shifting, and the shadows would shift with it. A decoy ship alone can fool the eye, but a fleet, an entire naval formation, must fool the ocean. The Phantom Fleet could not simply float, it had to inhabit its space convincingly. It had to cast the right shadows, sit at the right angles, and behave like steel displaced by thousands of tons of water. That meant controlling not just the ships, but the environment around them. The first major challenge was wake behavior. Real ships, even at anchor, disturb the water. Tidal shifts pull at hulls, currents push them subtly, and the water around them forms predictable patterns of turbulence. Engineers studied these patterns carefully, observing how cruisers and carriers naturally strained against mooring lines as tides rose and fell. To mimic this, decoys were anchored with elastic mooring systems that allowed gentle drifting. Pontoon frames were weighted unevenly to ensure slight rotations at different tide levels. Additional flotation bags were positioned below the surface to simulate deeper draft displacement. From altitude, this gave the illusion of mass, of a hull sitting deep in the water rather than hovering too lightly on the surface. The next challenge was shadow fidelity. Enemy reconnaissance relied heavily on the length, angle, and clarity of ship shadows during early morning flights. A destroyer casting the wrong shadow could betray the entire operation. To solve this, Navy camouflage artists adjusted the height of false masts and superstructures to ensure shadow geometry matched that of real vessels. They employed extended wooden mast frames, collapsible antenna structures, and even angled shadow boards that exaggerated or diminished silhouettes depending on the time of day. These refinements turned the decoys into optical equations, objects engineered to obey the sun. Then came surface realism. Canvas and plywood did not reflect light the way steel did. This problem threatened the integrity of every illusion. Camouflage specialists developed multi-layer paint schemes that reproduced the matte dullness of aged naval gray, the specular highlights of metal under bright sun, and the streaking typical of rust and salt corrosion. Some decoys even had artificial seams burned lightly into the canvas to imitate welded plates. Finally, the harbors themselves had to play a role. Every ship in a fleet occupies purposeful space. Destroyers sit near exits for rapid patrol. Carriers demand central berths for logistics. Cruisers guard fuel stores and dry docks. Real naval officers arranged the Phantom Fleet accordingly, ensuring that enemy reconnaissance analysts, trained to identify illogical patterns, would find none. The result was a kind of maritime stagecraft. A harbor transformed into a believable theater of steel and discipline. In the fog of morning, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot would see destroyers aligned in picket formation, cruisers moored in protective clusters, A carrier angled correctly for tide patterns and wind direction. Maintenance barges nearby. Fuel drums arranged in plausible numbers. And shadows that matched the sun's position precisely. Everything obeyed naval logic. Everything followed recognizable patterns. Everything seemed alive. And yet, under the calm water, the truth remained unchanged. These ships weighed almost nothing. They were illusions, fragile, temporary, and astonishingly effective. The Phantom Fleet was no longer a handful of decoys. It had become a system of controlled perception, an entire environment engineered to lie convincingly. And the Japanese would soon make decisions based on these lies. In Tokyo, the war rooms were quiet spaces, lit by dim lamps, filled with the soft rustle of paper, and marked by the distant tapping of typewriters. Reconnaissance photographs covered the tables. Thin red circles marked the silhouettes of ships anchored along the American coastline. Officers leaned over the images with magnifying lenses, tracing outlines, comparing proportions, and debating what those shadows meant. By late 1943, the Phantom Fleet had slipped so deeply into the rhythm of Japanese intelligence that no one questioned it anymore. The decoy carrier that appeared repeatedly in photos was treated as a familiar presence, a constant in the landscape of American naval readiness. Analysts spoke of it as though it were a real vessel, one they could almost recognize by shape alone. Destroyer silhouettes, always positioned where doctrine suggested they should be, reinforced the sense of a defensive line forming along the west coast. Even the fake maintenance structures added by American deception teams were interpreted as signs of active shipyard life. Inside the Imperial Navy's planning circles, a quiet confidence developed. The Americans were rebuilding their fleet, yes, but they were also keeping a significant portion of it near home. This created the impression that the United States was still cautious, still recovering, still unwilling to commit too deeply to the Central Pacific without first securing its own coastline. For Japan, that interpretation mattered. It suggested that the American momentum could be slower than feared. It suggested that the decisive battles might still lie months away. It suggested that there was time. The truth, of course, was very different. Every silhouette that gave Japanese planners this impression was made of wood, canvas, and layered paint. Every shadow that stretched across a harbor had been engineered by carpenters working through the night. The carrier, that seemed to stand guard over California's shipyards, had never displaced a single ton of seawater. But to the analysts in Tokyo, the images felt coherent, logical, familiar. Nothing about the Phantom Fleet contradicted their expectations. And in intelligence work, the most dangerous deception is the one that fits naturally into what you already believe. This illusion shaped decisions in subtle but meaningful ways. Japanese commanders redirected reconnaissance efforts toward other parts of the Pacific, believing the West Coast too well guarded for a decisive strike. They delayed plans that involved deep raids against American industrial centers. They allocated fewer resources to long-range submarine patrols off the continental United States. While Japanese planners debated photographs, real American shipyards operated with growing confidence. Essex-class carriers slid into the water. Destroyer escorts were completed in record numbers. Pilots trained relentlessly along the West Coast without fear of sustained attack. The United States was gathering strength at astonishing speed, hidden behind a curtain of illusions. And in the intelligence rooms of Tokyo, no one suspected that the reserve fleets they observed so diligently were nothing more than shadows drifting on pontoons. War, one officer wrote in a memo later decoded by American intelligence, is fog. But here, the Americans seem clearer than expected. He did not know that the clarity he saw was a mirage. The Phantom Fleet was no longer just a trick of wood and paint. It had become a quiet partner in shaping the war, guiding enemy attention away from the truth, and giving the United States exactly what it needed most in 1943: time. By early 1944, the Phantom Fleet was no longer a collection of isolated tricks hidden in the mist of American harbors. It had become a system, organized, disciplined, and surprisingly ambitious. What began as scattered wooden silhouettes had grown into an entire network of crafted illusions stretching from Puget Sound to the warm waters of Southern California. Harbors that once hosted only a handful of decoys now displayed full formations. In Seattle, carpenters erected the outline of a heavy cruiser so convincing that even American sailors passing at a distance mistook it for a new arrival. In San Francisco Bay, a false destroyer tender appeared beside a row of decoy escorts, positioned with such precision that the entire scene looked ready for inspection by a commanding officer. Naval camouflage units developed a rhythm of their own. Every few nights, crews moved the decoys slightly, just enough to mimic the subtle rotation of ships responding to currents or repositioning for maintenance. The movement patterns were deliberate. A destroyer nudged 5 degrees toward the channel, a cruiser shifted a few yards along the quay, a carrier's crew left simulated equipment on its deck to suggest routine activity. These details mattered enormously. A static illusion might fool a pilot once. A living harbor could fool an entire intelligence service for months. As the program expanded, so did its complexity. Engineers realized that realism required not just ships, but the entire ecosystem of a naval port. Fake fuel drums, false winches, mock anti-aircraft positions, and painted shadows beneath railings created depth where none existed. Even the weathering became an art form. Streaks of rust added carefully with tinted paint, marks on the hulls that followed patterns found on real steel plates exposed to salt air. The most ambitious addition came with the creation of fake support vessels, small barges, tugs, and service craft built with the same precision as the larger decoys. Their presence completed the illusion. A carrier alone might seem suspicious, a carrier served by maintenance barges, flanked by refueling drums, and watched over by escort silhouettes looked authentic. To an enemy pilot, this was a living port. One deception officer later wrote, "We were no longer building ships, we were building environments." And he was right. The harbors themselves had become staged realities, crafted to perform convincingly under the scrutiny of lenses 1,000 meters above the water. The United States also refined its sense of timing. They knew Japanese submarines launched reconnaissance flights during specific windows, at dawn, when shadows were longest and details were clearest, during overcast days, when contrast softened, and after storms, when debris in the water could act as natural camouflage. Decoy adjustments were scheduled around these patterns, ensuring the fleet always appeared active at the right moments. Meanwhile, real American warships were increasingly absent from the West Coast, not because of weakness, but because the Pacific campaign was accelerating. Carriers, battleships, and destroyers were moving forward toward the Marianas, the Philippines, and beyond. Their berths at home sat empty. The Phantom Fleet filled those voids perfectly. To the Japanese eye, the West Coast still looked defended, still busy, still guarded by steel. Yet in reality, the American naval center of gravity had already shifted thousands of miles west. The deception had bought the United States the freedom to commit virtually its entire Pacific force to the offensive, without revealing the true extent of its boldness. The shadows, once static, were now part of a larger choreography. A quiet dance of appearances and absences. A performance meant for an audience that never realized it was watching a stage. And the war, silently, began to depend on those shadows. From the cockpit of a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, the American coastline looked strangely orderly. The world below, its harbors, warehouses, drydocks, and cranes, appeared frozen in disciplined geometry. The pilot, strapped into a narrow seat above the vast Pacific, banked slowly as he approached the shoreline. Sunlight flashed across the water, revealing shapes aligned with the confidence of a prepared fleet. He steadied the aircraft, descended through the thinning haze, and lifted a pair of binoculars to his eyes. There they were again. A carrier, unmistakable in profile, its deck glimmering with the faint color variations caused by weathered paint. A cruiser sat angled at a familiar offset, as if guarding the entrance to the shipyard. A line of destroyers rested side by side, slender silhouettes stretching across the bay like blades laid out for inspection. Nothing in the scene contradicted expectation. Nothing seemed theatrical or artificial. Nothing betrayed the truth. What the pilot didn't know What he couldn't know from altitudes where detail dissolved into light was that the smooth deck of that carrier was canvas pulled tight over wooden ribs, that the gentle swaying of the cruiser was a trick of pontoons responding naturally to the tide, that one of the destroyers had been repositioned only hours earlier, dragged silently across the water by a tugboat no larger than a fishing vessel. Through the camera mounted beneath his aircraft, he captured the entire harbor in a single sweep. Photographs that would later be studied by analysts in Tokyo, men who trusted shadows, angles, and silhouettes more than words. To them, this scene would look like readiness. To them, it would appear that the U.S. Navy was still maintaining a substantial defensive posture at home. To them, it would suggest that American confidence had not yet shifted fully into the offensive. The images reinforced a familiar narrative, that the United States was cautious, rebuilding at a steady pace, preparing for something but still guarding its coastline with attention. In truth, the real American fleet was hundreds of miles west, engaged in operations that would soon determine the fate of the Central Pacific. Essex-class carriers were already fighting in the Marshalls. Fast carrier task forces were striking deep into enemy-held waters. Destroyer groups were escorting amphibious assaults. Submarines were choking Japanese supply lines. The west coast was nearly empty. But from the air, it looked alive. The deception worked not because the decoys were perfect, but because they echoed patterns Japanese pilots expected to see. The eye often notices what it believes should be there. And in war, expectation is powerful currency. As the reconnaissance plane banked away, the pilot transmitted a simple message: nothing elaborate, nothing dramatic. Just a routine confirmation. Harbor activity observed. Multiple ships present. That was all Tokyo needed to read. The Phantom Fleet had performed flawlessly. Below, the wooden silhouettes drifted gently in the breeze, their canvas skins shimmering slightly as the sun climbed higher. Workers would come at night to adjust their angles and repaint sections faded by salt air. A carrier's false mast would be reinforced. A destroyer's rust would be refreshed. A new shadow panel might be nailed into place. Everything was fragile. Everything temporary. Everything unbelievably effective. And as the reconnaissance aircraft disappeared into the horizon, the harbor returned to silence, its ships waiting patiently for the next set of eyes to deceive. Most wartime operations are recorded in the voices of admirals and generals, but the Phantom Fleet belonged to quieter hands. It was built not by celebrated strategists, but by carpenters who worked in blackout conditions, by painters who understood the science of shadow, and by engineers who could imitate a ship's geometry with little more than rope, canvas, and intuition. Along the west coast, the workshops where the decoys were born hardly resembled military spaces. They smelled of sawdust and wet paint, not diesel or hot steel. Inside these makeshift sheds, teams gathered each night, men who had spent their pre-war lives building movie sets, repairing fishing boats, crafting storefront signs, or painting landscapes on canvas. Now, those same skills were needed for national defense. A former Hollywood scenic designer found himself studying the curvature of destroyer bows, recreating them with flexible wooden ribs bent into perfect arcs. A coastal carpenter from Washington State became responsible for shaping the angled armor of cruiser turrets, armor that was nothing more than thin boards joined at precise angles to mimic steel plating. And then there were the painters, men who understood light as a living thing. They experimented endlessly with shades of navel gray, noting how each tone behaved under fog, under morning light, under glare reflected from calm water. They learned to paint false seams, false doors, and false maintenance stains, details that would never be noticed individually, but which merged into the subconscious realism of the whole. One painter later said, "A good decoy didn't look perfect. It looked lived in." These teams worked quietly, often under the cover of darkness, because secrecy mattered. The fewer civilians who understood what was happening on the docks, the safer the illusion remained. Many workers were told only what they needed to know, that the structures they built were harbor installations or training models. Few realized they were helping create a fleet that would never sail, and yet would influence the course of the war. The engineers, meanwhile, focused on structure. They studied tidal patterns, wind directions, and the subtle forces that shaped the movement of real ships. Their challenge was not just to build an object that looked like a destroyer. It was to build one that behaved like a destroyer, even if only slightly. If a silhouette rocked with the wrong rhythm, if it sat too lightly on the water, the illusion risked collapse. So they improvised solutions. Weighted pontoons for stability. Elastic moorings to mimic drift. Subsurface floats to simulate draft depth. Night after night, these modest workshops transformed raw lumber into the outlines of power. The workers rarely saw the result beyond their immediate contribution. Most never looked upon the entire harbor from the vantage point where enemy pilots would. Their world was the inside of the hull, the shape of a mast, the curve of a bow. And yet their work, invisible by design, carried strategic weight that steel alone could not. In war, the front line is not always a beach or a trench. Sometimes it is a dim, echoing workshop where a man with a paintbrush and a steady hand decides exactly how a shadow will fall at dawn. These artisans and engineers were never meant to be seen, but their illusions were. And soon, the Phantom Fleet would be tested not just by reconnaissance, but by an enemy seeking confirmation through far more aggressive means. Throughout early 1944, intercepted Japanese signals hinted at something the United States had feared since Pearl Harbor: a renewed interest in striking the American mainland. Not a full-scale assault, Japan no longer had the strength for that, but a targeted operation meant to disrupt shipyards, fuel depots, and morale. The kind of strike that could shake a coastline already living in tension. The plan under evaluation in Tokyo was modest but symbolically powerful. A submarine would approach quietly under cover of night, surface just beyond the reach of coastal radar, and launch a small seaplane fitted with incendiaries. The aircraft would fly toward one of America's major naval yards, Puget Sound, San Pedro, or San Diego, drop its bombs, photograph the results, and escape. A strike like this would not cripple the United States, but it would force Americans to feel the war again. Japanese planners sifted through reconnaissance photos to choose a target. They sought a harbor with visible ships, because a strike against nothing risked being dismissed as a futile gesture. They also wanted evidence that hitting those ships might cause disruptions, fires, delays, confusion. What they found was the Phantom Fleet. In the photographs, the harbors seemed active. Destroyers aligned in disciplined rows. Cruisers resting near fuel facilities. A carrier still moored in the same bay where it had appeared in earlier images. Maintenance structures shifting slightly over time, suggesting ongoing repair cycles. To Tokyo, this looked like a tempting target. A way to strike a symbolic blow without venturing too deep into American defenses. But the deception officers in the United States were watching just as closely. Signals intelligence confirmed increased chatter around West Coast harbors. Analysts pieced together the probability of a seaplane attack. The question was simple. Would the Japanese commit aircraft to a strike based solely on the shadows they'd been observing? The American answer was to push the illusion even further. In the weeks that followed, the Phantom Fleet received careful enhancements. Tiny details meant to amplify the sense of opportunity for an incoming attacker. A section of the fake carrier's deck was deliberately left exposed, as though under repair. A decoy destroyer was angled awkwardly, simulating a ship still undergoing maintenance. Smoke pots were lit at strategic points on foggy mornings, hinting at industrial activity. Everything was meant to whisper. This port matters. This port is alive. This port is worth attacking. But something else was happening behind the curtain. Something the Japanese never realized. As the Phantom Fleet made the coastline appear crowded, the real U.S. Navy quietly withdrew the last significant combat vessels from the region. Shipyards shifted focus to support operations further west. The home front grew emptier, quieter, more vulnerable. And yet, from above, it all looked fortified. When the Japanese High Command finally reviewed the options for their seaplane assault, they dismissed one West Coast target after another. Not because they lacked ships, but because they seemed too well defended. A harbor lined with silhouettes looked like a trap. A coastline that appeared guarded by cruisers and a carrier seemed too costly for a symbolic strike. Why risk a seaplane and a submarine against a fleet that might retaliate. Ultimately, the operation was postponed, and then postponed again, and eventually, quietly abandoned. The strike never came. The bombs were never dropped. The coast never saw the seaplane that had been destined for it. A decision halfway across the Pacific, based entirely on photographs of ships that did not exist, had preserved American cities from an attack that might have reignited fear across the country. The Phantom Fleet had absorbed not just bombs, but the very intent of the enemy. Shadow defeating steel. Silence defeating action. And that night, the night of the attack that never happened, was a triumph as invisible as the fleet itself. Long before the Phantom Fleet took shape in American harbors, the craft of illusion had already found a home on the West Coast. Hollywood, with its painted backdrops and fabricated worlds, was only a few dozen miles from the shipyards now tasked with deceiving the Japanese Navy. It was almost inevitable that these two worlds, a nation at war and an industry built on make-believe, would collide. The U.S. Navy quickly realized that shipwrights alone could not create believable decoys. Steel vessels had weight, personality, and presence. They carried the scars of work. Their shadows rolled with the tide. Engineers understood structure, but Hollywood's artisans understood perception. They understood how an object should appear to the eye of someone who wanted to believe it was real. So the Navy quietly recruited from studios, set designers, matte painters, lighting experts, scenic carpenters. Some left mid-project from famous productions, their names erased by wartime discretion. A few brought techniques no war planner would have thought to request. One designer, known for crafting ornate palace interiors for historical epics, adapted his skill to paint rust streaks down the hulls of decoy destroyers. He understood how water dripped, how time stained surfaces, and how imperfections could make a thing feel authentic. Another, who had spent years building wooden facades for westerns, devised quick-assembly mast structures that could be raised or lowered in hours, perfect for adjusting silhouettes just before a reconnaissance flight. Hollywood's influence didn't end with artistry, it extended into performance. The decoys became sets. The harbors became stages. And every Japanese pilot observing from the sky became an unwitting audience. Lighting experts advised the Navy on how morning haze and late afternoon glare altered the appearance of shapes on water. They created subtle gradients of paint to mimic the way steel reflected light unevenly, a trick that made even the simplest plywood surface feel metallic from altitude. One scenic artist introduced a technique borrowed from matte painting. By applying slightly darker tones along certain lines of the hull, he gave the illusion of depth where none existed. The effect was astonishing. A flat wooden surface suddenly looked like a curved steel plate reflecting the cold geometry of naval architecture. The collaboration went further. Hollywood carpenters taught naval crews how to assemble and disassemble large structures quickly, skills honed on film sets where entire towns appeared and vanished overnight. These techniques allowed the Phantom Fleet to shift positions mysteriously, as though following the rhythms of real naval operations. Sometimes the work was almost playful. Workers added small touches, a painted broom leaning against a fake bulkhead, a false coil of rope set just right on a deck, fake vents that suggested a humming engine below. Tiny details no reconnaissance pilot would consciously notice, but which the human brain absorbed all the same. This partnership between film and military became a quiet triumph of American improvisation. In a war fought with radar, broken codes, industrial might, and carrier aviation, it was easy to overlook the power of illusion crafted by human hands. But here, on the West Coast, where shadows needed to look like steel and stillness needed to feel alive, Hollywood shaped the battlefield. It blurred the line between reality and deception just enough to turn imagination into a weapon. And as the Pacific War escalated, that weapon would continue to influence the enemy's decisions. One silhouette at a time. By mid-1944, the Phantom Fleet had proven its worth. It fooled reconnaissance aircraft, shaped Japanese decision-making, and protected shipyards during the years when America's real naval power was still gathering. But deception, like any other weapon, must evolve. A static illusion eventually invites suspicion. And so the Americans did something bold, they taught their shadows how to move. The first step was subtle. For months, decoy ships had been repositioned by night, dragged by small tugboats along predetermined paths. These adjustments were slight, just enough to suggest tide-induced drift or routine harbor management. But now, planners wanted something more dynamic, something that could mimic the patterns of a fleet preparing for operations. Movement had to look purposeful. Engineers and naval officers studied how real carriers and cruisers behaved during readiness cycles, how they aligned themselves with prevailing winds, how destroyers shifted positions to create clear approach paths, how support craft clustered around larger vessels during fuel transfers or repairs. Then they translated these behaviors into a choreography of illusion. At certain intervals, decoy destroyers were moved outward, aligning their bows toward the harbor mouth as though preparing for patrol. The fake cruiser was rotated slightly and moored beside new maintenance scaffolding, its angle mimicking a vessel undergoing final checks. The wooden carrier, still the centerpiece of the entire deception, was shifted to a deeper anchorage, giving the impression that engineers were preparing it for departure. From above, these changes looked like operational rhythm. But the most ambitious innovation came with the creation of towed silhouettes. American engineers designed lightweight frames that could be pulled behind tugboats or small supply craft in near-complete silence. These silhouettes, simple outlines of destroyers or patrol boats, were never meant for stationary deception. They were for motion only. At the right angles and distances, especially when seen through a haze of morning light or a mist rolling in from the ocean, the effect was uncanny. To a reconnaissance pilot, the movement of these shapes suggested a fleet alive with purpose. And still, the Americans did not stop. They introduced small disturbances in the water, patterns resembling the wakes of vessels maneuvering at slow speed. Some were natural, crafted by arranging the decoys at locations where currents regularly shifted. Others were artificial, tugboats dragging weighted ropes just below the surface, carving faint, curved lines in the water that from altitude resembled the path of a destroyer moving to a new position. It was a kind of maritime calligraphy, written for the benefit of eyes thousands of meters above. At night, workers sometimes placed dim lights behind canvas panels on the decoy carrier, imitating the glow of activity deep inside the ship. These lights were shielded, directed downward or inward, never outward, carefully controlled to avoid breaking blackout regulations. The effect was subtle, almost ghostly, but when captured by a long-exposure camera, it hinted at a living crew. The goal was not to fool close inspection. The goal was to mislead distant observers who had only seconds to interpret what they saw. This new phase transformed the Phantom Fleet from a static shield into a dynamic story, one that suggested movement, readiness, and intention. A story the Japanese, relying on sporadic reconnaissance and outdated assumptions, continued to believe. And as the real American fleet moved steadily westward, preparing for operations that would decide the future of the Pacific, the harbors back home remained animated by silhouettes that could not fight, could not sail, and could not speak. Yet they spoke to the enemy just the same. Quietly, patiently, convincingly. The shadows had learned how to move. No deception survives unchanged. Even the most convincing illusion eventually meets a sharper eye, a shift in priorities, or a new intelligence officer who refuses to accept the familiar at face value. By late 1944, far from the harbors of California and Washington, a quiet doubt began to form inside segments of the Japanese intelligence community. The doubt did not come suddenly. It crept in through small details, tiny inconsistencies noticed by analysts reviewing months of reconnaissance photos. One officer in Tokyo questioned why the same carrier seemed to reappear in the same western bays, its silhouette unchanged despite the growing intensity of the Pacific War. Another wondered why certain destroyers cast shadows that looked strangely similar across different days, as though painted from memory rather than captured anew. These murmurs were not enough to disprove the illusion, but they were enough to stir a kind of professional unease. If the Americans were sending fast carrier groups deep into the Central Pacific, why did so many vessels remain at home? If the U.S. fleet was as massive as reports suggested, why didn't these harbors show the chaos expected of wartime ship turnover? The questions were logical. And, ironically, They were a sign that the deception had worked almost too well. When fragments of these doubts reached U.S. naval intelligence, thanks to intercepted communications, American deception officers realized something obvious but urgent. The Phantom Fleet could not remain static. Its story needed new chapters. So the Americans adapted. In some harbors, a few decoy ships disappeared, their wooden frames dismantled quickly during the night, as though they had sailed out to join distant operations. In other locations, previously unseen silhouettes suddenly appeared, taller or shorter than before, suggesting newly built vessels or returning units. A false escort carrier, a class that did exist in large numbers, was assembled in one bay, its blocky profile instantly recognizable from the sky. To keep pace with real-world developments, the Navy painted new hull numbers on some of the decoys. These numbers corresponded not to actual ships, but to plausible designations that fit into the complex numbering system of U.S. fleet organization. Analysts in Tokyo, already overwhelmed with tracking American production, simply logged them without question. The Americans even simulated the industrial noise of a harbor under pressure. Smoke pots operated at dawn, creating thin, drifting columns above select buildings. Crates were stacked near piers, some real, others painted. At night, dim lights blinked from inside warehouse windows to imitate round-the-clock repair work. And all of it, every plank, every flicker, every shadow, was crafted with one purpose: to smother doubt before it grew into certainty. Meanwhile, the Japanese reconnaissance effort was collapsing under the weight of distance, attrition, and shifting priorities. Submarines capable of launching aircraft were increasingly needed elsewhere. Radar-equipped American patrols made approaches far riskier. Fuel shortages limited long-range missions. Every reconnaissance flight cost Japan resources it could no longer spare. So the Phantom Fleet did what the real U.S. Navy often did at sea. It endured. When Japanese analysts revisited their earlier suspicions, the new photos, showing changes, turnover, believable evolution, soothed their doubts. The illusion had regained its credibility. In war, truth often depends not on evidence, but on consistency. And the Phantom Fleet, through constant adaptation, gave the enemy exactly the consistency they needed. Shadows that shifted. Shadows that evolved. Shadows that seemed alive. And on the other side of the ocean, no one realized that it was all theater. By early 1945, the war had shifted so far west that the American coastline no longer felt like a threshold. It felt like a memory, quiet, distant, untouched by the storms now breaking over Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Phantom Fleet, once a vital shield of silhouettes and shadows, still floated in its harbors, but the eyes that once studied it were no longer watching. Japanese reconnaissance had all but vanished. The submarines that once risked the long journey to American shores were now hunted relentlessly across the Pacific. Fuel shortages strangled long-range missions. And the strategic map of the war had collapsed inward. Tokyo no longer cared about the American West Coast. It cared about survival. The Phantom Fleet, ironically, remained exactly where it had always been: patient, silent, dutiful. But the stage lights had dimmed. The audience had left the theater. Night after night, the decoys rocked gently in the tide. Canvas hulls breathed in and out with the wind. Painted shadows softened under the long, orange glow of coastal sunsets. Yet no enemy aircraft traced their angles anymore. No submarine periscope paused to study their positions. No analyst in Tokyo leaned over fresh photographs, trying to interpret their meaning. It was as though the illusion had outlived the myth it once fed. For the workers who maintained the decoys, the carpenters, painters, and engineers, the silence was almost unsettling. They continued to repair torn canvas, re-stretch hull frames, and repaint weathered surfaces, even though they knew the war had moved far beyond their work. Some felt pride in the quiet dignity of the task. Others felt a strange melancholy, aware that their creations were fading into irrelevance before they ever had a chance to be truly understood. The U.S. Navy itself no longer issued detailed instructions for the decoys. Priorities had shifted toward supporting amphibious operations, carrier strikes, and preparations for the final assaults on Japan. The real fleet was now a giant, immense, mobile, and unstoppable. The shadows back home seemed small by comparison. In some harbors, wooden destroyers were slowly towed to shore and dismantled. In others, they remained in place for weeks, forgotten except by gulls that perched on their hollow masts. The great fake carrier, once the star of the illusion, creaked softly as its canvas skin loosened under cold salt wind. No enemy pilot would ever mistake it for steel again. And yet, even in this fading, there was a kind of strange beauty. These silent silhouettes had shaped decisions across an ocean. They had absorbed enemy attention. They had protected real ships and real workers during the darkest years of the Pacific War. They had bought time, one of the most precious strategic resources any nation can possess. But time also erodes purpose. And as 1945 rolled on, the Phantom Fleet drifted quietly into the final phase of any deception: obsolescence. No ceremonies marked its end. No official orders praised its contribution. Its greatest victories had been invisible by design, and its final disappearance was just as quiet. The war was now reaching its climax far from these peaceful harbors. And soon, the Phantom Fleet would face not an enemy's gaze, but the hands of the very people who had built it. The end was near. Not with fire, but with dismantling. Not with glory, but with silence. When the war finally ended, the real American fleet sailed home to applause, headlines, and a nation finding its breath again. But in quiet corners of the West Coast, another fleet waited. One without engines, without sailors, without a single battle honor. The Phantom Fleet did not return triumphant. It simply remained where it had always been, still, patient, and made of wood. Dismantling the decoys was not a ceremony. There were no speeches, no photographs, no recognition of the strange power these silhouettes had held. Carpentry crews simply arrived at the docks with crowbars and saws, the same tools they had once used to build the illusions. They worked in the same silence that had defined the project from the beginning. One by one, the shapes of war came apart. The canvas that once mimicked steel was pulled from its frames and folded like old sails. The wooden ribs that had traced the curves of cruisers and carriers were stacked into neat piles, ready for transport or burning. Painted symbols, hull numbers that had fooled analysts across an ocean, flaked away under the pressure of sun and salt. There was something almost intimate about the process. A ship of steel dies loudly, a ship of wood dies quietly. And these ghosts, having never lived as vessels, seemed to vanish even more softly. For the men who had crafted them, the moment was strangely bittersweet. A few paused to run their hands along the fading lines of a false bow. Others looked across the harbor, remembering how convincingly these shapes had once stood in the fog, guarding a coastline that now needed no defense. They had built illusions, not to deceive their own people, but to protect them. History would barely mention their work. Most wartime records focused on the great battles: the Philippines, Leyte Gulf, the Marianas, Okinawa. The Phantom Fleet became a footnote, referenced occasionally in technical reports or obscure intelligence files. Even after the war, many Americans never learned that their ports had once been guarded by shadows. But the legacy was real. The decoys had shaped enemy decisions at critical moments. They had drawn the attention of reconnaissance crews who might have otherwise discovered genuine vulnerabilities. They had made the West Coast appear guarded during its most fragile years. And they had bought the United States something priceless: the ability to wage war across the Pacific with confidence, knowing the home front lay behind a curtain of crafted illusions. In the final years of the conflict, the United States Navy became the most powerful maritime force in history, a machine of steel and aviation that no longer needed shadows to protect it. Yet those shadows had carried the war on their backs long before the real ships could. Today, nothing remains of the Phantom Fleet. No hulls rusting in forgotten bays. No monuments marking their service. Only scattered photographs, faint government memos, and the whispered memory of a deception so large it stretched across entire harbors. But if you stand at certain points along the West Coast at dawn, when the water is calm, when the light is soft, when the horizon still holds that thin silver glow, you can imagine those silhouettes again. A carrier that was never steel. A destroyer that never sailed. A cruiser that fooled a distant enemy. And for a moment, the Pacific gains its shadows once more. Shadows that defended a nation not with firepower, but with imagination.